We do need an intro song. Do you want to get out the guitar? You have time. All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to today's Black Hills Information Security Training with Beau Bullock on cloud, reaching the cloud perimeter. This is the first 4 hours of a 16-hour class, but you don't need to take the other 12 hours to understand what we're going to do today. If you have questions at any time, ask them in Discord. If you don't know what Discord is, then you probably missed the first hour or so of us teaching it and showing it. But if you do have a question for today's content, you can always ask in GoToWebinar. And we have a team of people in GoToWebinar to answer your questions, and we have a team of people in Discord to answer your questions. And I think that's it. If you ever need a pen test, let us know at Black Hills. But other than that, all right, Beau, it's all you.
All right.
And then everyone else, kill your cameras and microphones.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro, Jason. Welcome to Breaching the Cloud Perimeter. This is the very first time this has been done. So if everything just doesn't work, it's not my fault. It is, but hopefully everything will work fine. So if you don't have the slides yet, go grab them out of the slides channel in Discord. You're going to want to have them for sure, because once we get to the labs, there's commands you're going to want to copy and paste. Probably you're probably not going to type everything from the labs section. So I'd recommend go ahead and go grab those slides. If you haven't set up the prerequisite VMs yet in the accounts, now's probably a little bit late, but it's fine. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that the labs are self-contained. So if for some reason you don't get a chance to actually do the labs with me live, that's fine. I'm going to be demoing them, and the instructions that are in the actual slides should be good enough for you to go through them on your own after. And because they're self-contained, you're going to be able to just take the slides, and then once we get done with this whole thing, you don't have to do it now. You can do it later. It's totally fine. Like Jason mentioned, we're going to be taking breaks at the top of every hour. So we'll have the 10-minute breaks at the top of the hour to go use the restroom, get some more coffee, bourbon, whatever you need. I think that's it for logistics. So this is the beginning of a workshop that I built that initially, this is something that kind of came of necessity, which a lot of the tools that we use at Black Hills, a lot of the things that we've built, a lot of things that we've put out, a lot of things that pretty much anyone who's put out, it usually comes from some sort of necessity, right? Like, for example, Mail Sniper, back in 2016, really needed a reason or I needed some way to authenticate to OA and search everyone's email. And also, I wanted to search at scale. I wanted to be able to search inboxes of employees at an organization. So it kind of was a necessity for me to kind of have that tool, and it wasn't something that existed at the time. So a lot of the things that we do, especially like building a training course like this, should come out of a necessity. And with all these organizations that are moving to cloud-based infrastructure, we're seeing such an increase on pen tests where we're seeing just this influx of cloud-based assets, and it's really that we need a good methodology. A couple years ago, if you put AWS keys in my hand, I could probably authenticate with them, and then be like, okay, well, now I'm gonna have to go figure out what to do with those keys. Or the same thing, like with Azure, right? Like, okay, I'm authenticated to Azure. What next? Like, what is it that I can do with this? Can I do anything interesting? So I've spent probably a good part of the past year just strictly researching cloud-based attacks, and I've tried to put together a methodology so that if I'm on a red team assessment, if I'm on a pen test, I have this methodology now where if I get those creds, I can go and figure out what to do next. Like, I can actually do something useful with them. So first off, let me say thanks to everyone for even being here, because this is just amazing to have almost 1,000 people that want to spend a Saturday. I know the world's crazy right now. Everyone's probably stuck at home, but it's really cool to have so many people interested in it, InfoSec, and wanting to learn something and come and just hang out with me. Most of you don't know me, but this is a passion for me. So I love being able to share knowledge. So it's really cool to have all you guys here. This is part of a bigger class, okay? So this is the very first 4-hour portion of a total of 16 hours. So it's technically a 2-day full class that we're actually going to be doing over the course of 4 days. So at the end of June, this is going to be a 4-day course where between noon and 4 p.m. Eastern time for 4 days we'll be giving the rest of this. And this specific course, this one you're taking today, this workshop, is all about getting access. So there's a lot of blog posts, there's a lot of presentations, DEF CON talks on really interesting post-exploitation techniques. So things that have been done, after you get access. But getting access is part of the battle, right? Like how do I even authenticate to a cloud? So it's this whole thing. I really wanted to focus on building out this whole methodology so that whenever you approach an organization that says they utilize cloud resources, or you're doing recon, when you're like, let's say you're doing an external assessment or you're doing a red team assessment and you're remote, right? And you're doing your recon and you find that the organization is utilizing, Azure or AWS or Google Cloud. How do we approach trying to get access to that? That's really what this whole thing boils down to. And the cool thing about this course is it really kind of doubles methodology-wise as a straight up, just like, how am I going to attack any company? Because a lot of these techniques, while they're cloud specific, translate really well over to attacking like your traditional on-prem network. So if you've never done pen testing, this almost like I think would serve as a pretty good intro as well. A lot of the concepts are going to translate across. One thing that I will I guess disclaim, one disclaimer, is that this is not a blue team course by any means. I think that blue teamers will get something out of this. I think that you guys will see a lot of these methods, a lot of the tradecraft, a lot of the tools, the techniques that we will use to attack cloud-based infrastructure. But I don't have any specific like Splunk, rules. I don't have anything to give you to help detect a lot of this stuff. While I'm going through this, what I'll do is I'll say, hey, we're password sparing Azure now. So maybe, look at, the Azure logs and looking at smart lockout policies, that kind of thing. But like I said, I don't have any like blue team stuff for you, like real blue team, like here's how you check the logs. But trust me, I love you blue team guys. Don't hate on this just because of that. I built this 100% with the offensive mindset, and I wanted to be able to train pen testers and anyone who hasn't really done a lot of this cloud-based attack stuff for how to do it. All right, I guess that pretty much covers my intro. All right, so this roadmap kind of shows where we're going to go. The 3 bullet points at the bottom are the other 3 sections that are not in this course. Okay, so we're going to start out with breaching the cloud perimeter. This is, like I said, it's all how to get access. So we're going to start out talking about like cloud pentest authorization. So cloud pentest authorization meaning like what are you even allowed to test? Like it's different, right? Because can an organization explicitly give you permission to test these remote third-party hosted things? So we'll talk about that. Cloud authentication methods. This is a super important part because your authentication methods for cloud-based resources differ and are way more complex than your traditional on-prem authentication. So we're going to kind of dive deep a little bit into just how do you even connect and authenticate to the cloud, right? Then we're going to dive into Recon, and this section is going to be basically my methodology and a lot of us at Black Hills methodology on how we go about just performing our initial recon against an organization to find assets, to find hosts, to find domain names, to find users. A big part of attacking cloud-based infrastructure is to do like password spraying attacks. And to even do those, you need to know where the auth portals are, and you need to know, or you need to have a pretty decent user list. So we'll talk about how to do that. Then we're going to walk through exploiting straight up misconfigured cloud assets. So this is something that happens a lot. It's the things that you read about in the news. It's things that you should definitely be looking for any organizations you test. Then probably the largest portion of this entire thing is this gaining a foothold section. So once we get to the gaining a foothold section, this is going to encompass pretty much every way that I'm aware of currently, and just throughout the research that I've done for actually getting access, for getting some sort of foothold into a cloud environment. And then finally, we'll do some post-compromise recon. So the next course, the next portion of this class, focuses really heavily on post-compromise. So the pillaging cloud assets course, which is day 2 of this whole thing, actually focuses really deep on persistence, privilege escalation, and that kind of thing. But today, I wanted to give you kind of a very general, here's some things to look for. Here's some things to give you like a jump start into your post-compromise activities. So next one, like I said, pillaging cloud assets. Deep dive into persistence, privilege escalation, data harvesting. So that's the other big thing, right? Like is with organizations moving assets to the cloud, they now have a lot of data out there. Like, for example, anybody who uses O365, you've got so much email data out available in the cloud that if you can export and search that's super useful, right? And then the third portion, so this would be day 3, is all cloud infrastructure attacks. So the cloud infrastructure attacks focuses heavily on, okay, now we've got access to this cloud infrastructure. Can we do anything to pivot access to on-prem network? Can we write a VPN down? Can we write ExpressRoute down? Can we exploit web services? Can we exploit, or can we take like storage that's attached to a VM, analyze it, get secrets from it? A lot of that is in the cloud infrastructure attacks portion. Finally, the last section is all on weaponizing cloud for red team operations. So, most of us as red teamers, pen testers, have moved pretty much everything we do to some sort of cloud-based asset, just because it's super easy to spin up. It's great for certain types of attacks, like using like domain fronting to hide C2 channels. So that course is really built on leveraging cloud assets, and also using things like Azure DevOps to build payloads, things that are helpful. So that's pretty much it. Throughout this course, you'll see this roadmap throughout each section to kind of highlight where we've been and where we're going, to try to give you kind of like a good background on kind of where we're at currently. Okay. So cloud versus on-prem testing. What's different? Why is it important? So you will find that many of the same techniques apply, right? So a lot of the same things you're going to do to test an on-prem network is going to apply. We're still looking for credentials, right? We're still looking for misconfigurations. Those are two of the biggest highlights. One of the things that I think that it's something that I know John talks about a lot, I talk about it a lot, is that we as pen testers, we don't really do like a whole lot of exploiting anymore of what you would consider a traditional vulnerability. While yes, we have plenty of times where we'll find that somebody hasn't updated something, and we can run some sort of proof of concept to exploit against it, and it just works, right? But that is like super rare anymore. I would say 95% of the tests that I do, I don't do what you would consider an exploit. Pretty much the main things that we focus on are misconfigurations these days. And I think research-wise, this is something really important to look at too, because misconfigurations and finding holes that are misconfiguration issues tend to last a lot longer than your exploits, right? Because if you have something that gets patched, right, then you're not gonna be able to exploit anymore. So anyways, we're going to be looking for misconfigurations. the whole cloud thing is still very much a new frontier. Okay, so you've got all these organizations, especially right now is actually a big time for organizations that are just moving everything to the cloud because everyone has to work remote right now for the most part. You have a lot of people that have various VPN services set up where they're now giving everyone VPN access to their internal network, but you'll start seeing a lot more that are just straight up moving everything infrastructure wise to cloud-based resources. And the problem is that because it's new, because it's something that people haven't really done a lot, it leaves more room for misconfiguration. Typically, you look at like an on-prem like web server. Okay, so traditionally you would have like if you set it up in a decent security mindset, you would put like your web server in a DMZ and restrict access so that like if that got exploited, it can't really like do anything internally. But now with setting up web servers in AWS, setting up web servers in Azure, setting up web servers in GCP, the second you get a shell on those servers, you can do a lot more interesting things than you could from just a straight up like on-prem server. And it's due to a few different things, which we'll get into really, really detailed in a little bit. But for example, the metadata service that's available on these VMs by default, we'll talk about. You can talk to it on like after you get a shell on the web server and might get credentials from it. That's just one of those things. The whole on-prem AD being protected by a firewall, right? That's another thing, right? So with your on-prem Active Directory infrastructure, traditionally, an attacker can't just straight up query that, right? The second I get a credential to an O365 account now, if I am able to password spray an Office 365 account, if they're using Azure, by default, I can list every user. I mean, just like kind of the same way that like with O365 you have the GAL, right? The global address list. Well, you also have Azure Active Directory where you can also query that data as well, and it gives you a lot more. So I think that the second an organization decides to either be a hybrid organization where they're utilizing some on-prem, some cloud infrastructure, or the second they decide they want to move full cloud, it enables higher risk to orgs. Yeah, I just saw a comment about the autofocus. Yeah, sorry about that. I move around too much and I get kind of autofocused out. I apologize for that. So I'll try not to do it as much. Quick note on just who I am, because I'm going to be talking to you for the next 4 hours. So this is me. I'm a pen tester, red teamer at Black Hills. Yes, I know that the beard is different. Don't give me crap. I jumped on John's webcast a couple weeks ago, and I got so many comments about like, where's the beard? Like, this is false advertising. I'm not signing up for this. Like, so anyways, it comes and goes. It's one of those things. So sorry. I speak at a few different conferences. I build tools. I like guitar. Actually, John and I, we've played some metal shows together, John Strand, strangely enough. But anyways, that's me. Before I dive into this whole thing, I really want to do a straight up shout out and thanks to anyone who's ever posted anything offensive related, cloud, pen testing, blogs, book authors, open source developers, because there really isn't a whole lot of it out there. To be honest, the people who are doing research in this area are few and far between. And I think I've covered a pretty good list here. I'm sure there's probably some that I'm missing. But the work that Sean Metcalf's done, Carl Fossan from NetSpy, basically everyone on this list, like deep research into offensive tactics. And I can't thank them enough because going through the last year of just learning about most of this myself, I've been referencing so many of these guys and talking to them and trying to learn as much as I can from them. So this course really wouldn't be possible without everyone sharing. So if you are somebody who does any research or you have any knowledge, I totally implore you to share as much as you can, because I think that it'll help everyone get better. And I think that there's definitely a gap. I think that for cloud security right now, specifically cloud pen testing, there's not a whole lot out there. So actually, I'm going to point out one real quick. Chris Moberly from GitLab, I'm pretty sure he has the definitive guide out there for testing Google Cloud Platform. I basically couldn't find anything else that has substance for testing GCP. And he has put together, he actually has a talk that I totally recommend watching. He just released it. He was supposed to do it at a B-Sides event. Totally recommend watching his talk and reading that blog post if you want to learn more about GCP. But yeah, everyone on this list, follow them and read their posts because they're awesome. Okay. So what's the difference between AWS, Azure, and GCP, right? So, they all kind of do the same thing, right? They do similar things. I typically see AWS being, primarily used for like web services. So like on Pentest, a lot of times what I see AWS for is just straight up like I'm hosting up a web app, maybe, like AWS has pretty straightforward setups for a lot of different web services. I see enterprises leveraging Azure more for things like Microsoft 365, hybridizing their environments so that their employees can authenticate to O365 and On-Prem, and leveraging other services within Azure that kind of work with that. GCP, so if you've been following any of the like COVID-19 dashboards, like for example the Johns Hopkins dashboard, they're leveraging GCP's BigQuery for managing that data. And so I've seen GCP basically used mainly in like educational environments because they have like that pull on machine learning. Like they're really tied deeply into like big data analytics, that kind of thing. So for market share, kind of if you want to like think about it that way, but a lot of them have the same thing. So like in this screenshot here, you can see, for example, like virtual servers. It's instances on AWS, but it's called VMs on Azure. But a lot of these do the exact same thing. They're just called different names. One thing that I really wanted to point out is that Azure does not equal Microsoft or O365. They renamed it to Microsoft 365, not just O365. And then also GCP versus G Suite. Okay, so just because you are a Google Cloud Platform customer or you have a client that's a Google Cloud Platform customer does not mean that they're using G Suite. And same thing with Azure and Microsoft 365. Both G Suite and Microsoft 365 are productivity suites, right? So these are the productivity pieces, meaning that a user can do like word processing, they can send emails, that kind of thing. Whereas GCP and Azure are infrastructure and so much more. So like you have GCP, Azure that both support, spinning up a VM, spinning up databases, all kinds of stuff, right? Like there's like, 100 services that they have. They can live in harmony together though, okay? So you can have G Suite and Google Cloud Platform live in harmony together. You can have Azure and 365 living together. In fact, if you sign up for Microsoft 365, it will automatically create Azure AD for you. And so you'll have an Azure AD account technically just by signing up for Microsoft 365. All right, Cloud Pentest Authorization. So we're going to start talking about what you're allowed to test. Okay. So most cloud providers pretty much allow the testing of any company's assets without filling out any sort of forms anymore. So historically, what we used to have to do is we'd have to have the organization that's like an AWS customer, the organization that's an Azure customer, sign this form saying, hey, we're going to have a pen test and we're going to allow this company to do it. That has changed. And now, for the most part, you don't have to fill out any of these forms anymore. Okay? So I still would recommend, prior to actually assessing any cloud provider, that you check, the rules prior to each engagement. Because, clouds change, and I think that there's the potential there, right, for something changing and this statement not being true. But basically, most of the cloud platforms, GCP, Azure, AWS, don't require you to fill out any forms anymore. The other thing is you have to figure out with the customer if you're even allowed to, with them to test their assets. So during like your rules of engagement call, confirm with the customer if they have any cloud assets. So I would say like talk to them while you're discussing what's in scope and say, hey, do you guys even have anything out in any cloud provider? Because if you do, I might want to try to test them. Some typical no-nos: don't do any denial of service testing, don't do any intense fuzzing, because these are the types of things that like break infrastructure, and the cloud providers really don't want that to happen, right? Like they don't want their infrastructure just breaking. And then the other thing is like you can't straight up phish like the cloud employees. Like so you can't like phish Microsoft employees if you're testing, this company over here, which, that'd just be bad. And you can't test like another company's assets while you're testing the company that your target is. Lastly, most of these providers want you to report anything you find. So if throughout like your testing and you find something interesting, like a new vulnerability, they want you to tell them, right? So requests, there's a question, how many requests per second / minute / hour would you consider intense fuzzing? That's a good question. I mean, I think what does burp do by default? BB would actually probably be the main guy to ask for that. I think it's like 10 requests at a single time, like concurrent requests, I believe. But you can put limitations on that. I don't know. I would probably say like stick to under like 1,000 a minute, something like that. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Okay, so this is like the next 3 screenshots. I basically just threw in the link to where these companies store their the rules of engagement. So like this is Microsoft's notification that basically like they don't require it anymore. AWS, similar thing. They actually list out specific services, so like EC2, RDS. So definitely take a look at that if you plan on testing AWS. Same thing for GCP. Do I need to notify Google? If you plan to evaluate Google, you're not required to contact us. So it's basically the same throughout the 3 of these, right? Okay, authentication methods. So now that we've kind of established what we're allowed to test, we know that the organization's utilizing some sort of cloud-based resource. Where do I point my attacks? Where do I go for trying to compromise an account? So the thing with cloud authentication, I like to describe it kind of like the Death Star, right? So the Death Star, you've got like that main entry bay, right? Like you see like, like Luke and Han and Obi-Wan like flying in, right? Like they've got the main entry point, which is like, I would consider that your O365 login portal, right? Like you go to sign in for O365, like that's your main point. Like everyone's coming in there. However, there's a thermal exhaust port on the Death Star. There's this other place that you can get in, and a lot of times that place is not as well protected as it should be, and it might end up blowing up the infrastructure. So with on-prem attacks, right? So if we're testing a general on-prem company, we're really focused on usernames and passwords for the most part. Okay, right? So if we're external and we want to get access, we might do password spraying. We might do some phishing, which is great, right? But it still is going to require us getting some sort of username and password to do anything interesting with it. With Azure, AWS, GCP, for the most part, I would say this. For the most part, we're looking at access keys or APIs or certificates because they provide even more ways to authenticate, and a lot of times they are logged completely differently. And many times, like for example, on O365, you have legacy authentication portals like Exchange Web Services that's still enabled that you can authenticate to that is completely different logging-wise from your main O365 portal. And you get different configurations too, like multi-factor settings, right? So I've run into multiple organizations that have set up conditional access policies to enable 2FA for their employees through the primary authentication portal. But because of the limitations of these legacy auth portals, they are not covered by two-factor. So multiple times I've found where like a company has hosted up O365 as their main email platform, and I go off to it, and it's like, oh, Duo push to my phone, and I'm like, oh, okay, crap. What about AWS? And I go to connect in with Mail Sniper, and it's like, oh, you're good. No two-factor needed. So that is something really to consider here, and this is why I kind of reference the Death Star, right? Because like you have that main entry point that is guarded by 100 stormtroopers, which can't shoot very well, but they're there. But you have this thermal exhaust port that's not protected. Sometimes keys get posted publicly. So, like I mentioned, we're looking for keys to authenticate. So, I'll show you examples of what these keys are, but just know right now that this happens with code and developers. With the way that developers push out code, a lot of times they include these keys in the repositories because they don't either realize that they're there, or they think that it's not important, or I don't know. They get posted. The other thing is, so with keys and repos, we're going to talk about looking at them publicly, but also private repos is another very good source. So once you get a credential, actually trying to authenticate to a private repository and searching it. But really, it comes down to finding these authentication points. And throughout the next few slides, I'm going to talk about the different ways that Azure can be set up from an authentication perspective. And some of them change the way that you would authenticate to Azure. So some of them, like totally, you can hit Azure directly, but others, you have to actually authenticate to the on-prem like ADFS infrastructure and then get access to the cloud. So that's what's up next. All right. So this is kind of like a screenshot just of me just throwing some of these things to consider when it comes to authentication. I'm going to walk through, I have a slide for each one of these things that we're going to talk about. But basically, just know that when you set up Azure, specifically authentication to Azure, you can change how that authentication is done. So for example, you can do password hash synchronization versus pass-through authentication versus ADFS. So those are like the three primary methods for setting up your authentication. But on the other side of it, you can have users that authenticate like service principals that can authenticate with certificates. You can have conditional access policies that state that only a user can sign in from this device or this IP address, or like things like that are conditional based. You have long-term access tokens. So with things like AWS, you have access keys, secret keys that last forever, and they're just long-term access tokens. And second you find them, you have access. And then lastly, the legacy authentication portals is kind of what I mentioned on the last slide. So these are good to understand because visually they're going to appear different. One of the things that I've noticed is, before I really dove into this, is I would be on a pen test for a company, and I would one of the first things I always try is just to determine if they have O365 usage is just straight up go to the O365 like login portal and type in an email address. So like test@domainname.com. And if you get redirected, typically they're using some sort of Azure usage or O365. But one of the things that I was confused on initially is I would have some companies where I'd go to authenticate and I would just enter a username, and then I'd get redirected to a completely different server. There was like an on-prem server. Okay, so something that was not hosted at O365, but something that was on-prem. And this is where my confusion kind of like came in, like, okay, so what are these environments? So that would be ADFS, which we'll talk about in just a few slides. Okay, so password hash synchronization. This is where all your credentials for your users are fully cloned into Azure. Okay, so every single user's credential is straight up stored in Azure. And the way that happens is with the Azure AD Connect service. Okay, so you have an on-prem service that is constantly talking back and forth with Azure and updating these credentials. the cool thing about this is that authentication can be from anywhere. So your users, your employees can straight up authenticate to Azure and O365 directly, and there's no redirection to like an on-prem server. Yeah, the AD Connect thing. Okay, so it's interesting because since the AD Connect service is constantly updating, there have been vulnerabilities found. So like Dirk Jan, one of the main researchers in Azure security, found a vulnerability where the AD Connect account could be utilized to just straight up dump all the creds for the domain, because the Azure AD Connect account can DC sync. So this is actually a really good target, right? So if you're on an internal test, and let's say you do Bloodhound, right? You run Bloodhound, instead of just looking for paths to domain admins, now start looking for paths to the Azure AD Sync service account. Because if you get access to that account, it's essentially a domain admin. It can DC sync. So that's a prime location to hit up. The next one is pass-through authentication. So the way this works is you don't have any actual credentials stored in the cloud. All your credentials are stored on-prem, and there's another service, this pass-through authentication service that constantly queries Azure. And as people are trying to sign in to the Azure portal, the service is actually authenticating them on the back end to your on-prem domain. Okay, so with this one, if you're internal, there's another vulnerability. So this one, Adam Chester, XPN, there's actually a little bit of kind of a confusion this last week, because Varonis actually posted a blog post where they identified this vulnerability that Adam Chester had talked about like a year or two ago. He had a blog post already out there. And basically the vulnerability is that if you get access to the Connect service, you can do the same thing where you can actually, as people are authenticating to Azure, you can get their clear text credentials from the service. So basically, yeah, like while users are authenticating, you can just straight up sniff their creds of sorts, you know. But yeah, I mean, both PTA, so pass-through authentication, and password hash synchronization look very similar from the outside, because as a user, you're just authenticating to this public portal. So the last one, this one looks very different from the other two. So this is Active Directory Federation Services. So whenever an organization wants to keep their credentials on-prem, and they want to be able to set up a trust to O365, they set up this on-prem ADFS server that whenever you go to authenticate to O365, like if you look at like the screenshot here, the bottom right has the extranet user. They go to sign in to a web application proxy that actually redirects that authentication request to an on-prem ADFS infrastructure. And the on-prem ADFS infrastructure then gives them a token that allows them to access these cloud resources. So yeah, that's the main difference there. So for password attacks, this is a huge difference, because with password attacks and Azure, you're hitting Azure endpoints like the Microsoft Graph API, or hitting O365 directly. Whereas on-prem now with ADFS, you're hitting an ADFS service. And for spraying ADFS, I mean, honestly, most of the time I just use Burp. I haven't specifically used a different tool, but Burp Suite is pretty good for doing password spraying against those ADFS services. I see a comment, is anyone's slide stuck? So you should be able to see the certificate-based authentication slide. Is that where everyone's seeing right now, or are people having issues?
Generally, if people refresh, that should fix the issue, or change to a different browser.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the authentication methods, those last three slides are basically kind of to help you understand how an organization can set it up. Now, these next two kind of talk about ways that you can have accounts actually authenticate. So client certs is an option other than user credentials. So historically, back when you had like Azure Classic or Azure Service Management, you would create these management certificates, and these management certificates could be utilized to authenticate. They've actually since done away with that in place of service principals. So now, since they've actually changed from Azure Service Management over to Azure Resource Manager, you no longer have the management certs anymore. But you can still set up service principals to auth with certs. So you're going to want to look for client-based certificates. Like, this is just one of the things that if you get access to a system or get access to somebody's email, maybe they've emailed a cert. I mean, Derek and I have been on assessments where people have straight up emailed VPN certs to each other, and we were able to leverage those to get access to an organization. Somebody that was using like it was a combo between just username and password and a VPN cert. So in that case, they were considering it 2FA, right? I mean, it kind of is, because something you have, but in something you know, right? Like your password. But in that case, we got access to this guy's email that was not 2FA'd, and we're able to get his cert from the email and then use the cert to authenticate. So something to kind of consider is just certificates in general. Let's see. Next slide. OAuth tokens are very, very important. We're going to have a lab later today where we actually are going to steal Azure tokens and then use them to authenticate to Azure. Most of the desktop CLI tools, so things like the Azure PowerShell modules, they create tokens on disk. And so if you get access to somebody's system that has utilized those PowerShell modules, you might be able to just straight up steal them and then reuse them. And the other thing that's cool too is like with these tokens, you can authenticate to different endpoints sometimes. So like with like the Azure PowerShell modules, you can use the tokens to authenticate to like the Microsoft Graph API, which is good for enumerating a ton of information about the domain. I'll talk to you later about a brand new tool that Dirk Jan released called Road Tools that specifically just talks to the Microsoft Graph API and enumerates all the data from Azure. For AWS, we've got two primary things to really consider here. We've got Programmatic Access, which is your standard access key and secret key, which most of you have probably seen. These are generally used to generate accounts that don't need web console access. So these are used in code a lot, right? So these are the things probably the primary thing we're going to look for in repos, right? We're going to look to try to find these things. And then you have the web console access. So this would enable a user to straight up sign into the management console. And having web console access is super useful if you don't really have that much familiarity with using the command line tools. This is something that we can give ourselves too, which is really cool. Like, so if you get access keys, you can actually give yourself console access, which I have a lab on that in the next portion, the next course, the next day. Oh, hey, Jason, what's up?
Hey, man. Quick question from the audience. Is service principal the equivalent to service account in GCP?
I think so, yeah. I don't think there's any differences. They're very similar. But, okay, so with service principals in Azure, it basically facilitates the authentication as a web account. They're very similar. I would say that the answer is probably yes. With GCP, you've got the JSON tokens that a service principal can authenticate with. With Azure, service principals can have an actual like password. And in fact, one of the main privilege escalation vulnerabilities that, again, next class privilege. So sorry that this one doesn't dive too much deep into it, but I'll talk about it here for a second. Is that one of the main priv attacks in Azure is that if you're an O365 customer, that service sets up like 200 or more service principals by default. And so all of these accounts do different things. Like there's like a SharePoint service principal, there's various like Microsoft Graph Service Principals. There's all these things, and they all have different roles within Azure. And if you have an application administrator account, the application administrator can't always do things like add users to groups or whatever, but it can change passwords for service principals. So one of the main privilege escalation techniques is get an application administrator account, change the password for a service principal that has more privileges than you, use that service principal to authenticate, and then do something with higher privileges. That was another thing that Dirk Jan, he did a whole DEF CON talk on, which is really, really cool. So this slide is, another question?
Yeah, just a real quick one. Given you need to have these keys in your code for it to function, how do you propose you do this in a safe way in repos?
I would say it comes down to permissions and access to those, right? So you definitely don't want to publish in public, right? Like that is a no-no. Is publishing access keys public is a bad idea. When it comes to private repos, 2FA is something that is probably a must, right? Even with 2FA, a lot of times people can authenticate with API keys, but I think 2FA on a private repo is probably the answer there. But these are basically what we're looking for, right? So this is secret keys and access keys for AWS. These are like if you find yourself looking at this screenshot on a pen test, you have some really awesome things to work with, because the access key and the secret key ID are basically like a username and password of sorts for authenticating. This is the programmatic access. And from here, this is where we start using like the AWS CLI and other tools to start enumerating what access we have. So after you get access to this kind of stuff, a lot of times these are already privileged, but it might be necessary to look at privilege escalation vulnerabilities and whatnot. So yeah, huge chunk of the next course is PrivEsc, like I said, but this will kind of cover what we have so far. Okay, so authentication methods for Google. Again, so with Google and G Suite, they're different, but from the outside, authenticating looks kind of similar. So if you go to authenticate to cloud.google.com, you get the traditional Google login portal, which will work if you have a Google account, but it won't actually give you cloud access unless you have a cloud account. If that makes sense. They're technically like separated things. With Google, obviously web access is one thing, right? Being able to log in as a Google admin or connecting via API. This is something we'll look for API keys. Access tokens are in Google considered short-lived access tokens. So these are like the question that was mentioned before, service accounts have these like short-lived access tokens that are available to them that only hang around for a little bit. And then you have long-lived key pairs, which are these JSON key files. These are probably the primary thing you might run across on a pen test, right? Like if you find somebody has downloaded these JSON key pairs for accessing Google. Same thing with the other two services, they can be federated as well. Oh, let me back up. There we go. Okay, so roadmap. Quick roadmap here. We're up to the reconnaissance point. That last section was really kind of more just to give you guys a good idea of what's the authentication attack surface, what could potentially go wrong. But now we're going to look at cloud asset discovery. So we're going to try to find hosts, and we're going to do some user enumeration. And like I mentioned, this kind of functions really well as a standalone, like, hey, here's just some general recon that we can do for any organization. One of the questions was, do the JSON key files have a specific name to search for? So no, the answer is no. You can save it as whatever title you want. That's what makes it kind of tricky. I would recommend looking in like downloads directories or project directories for any Google projects. The other thing you could look for is command line history, right? For like the G-Cloud tool, right? If somebody uses G-Cloud tool, they might be actually pointing it at the JSON key file locally. And so via the command line history, you might find it. Hope that answers that. Okay. So we have to find things to attack. Okay. So this is the first step of pretty much any pen test we do, any red team we do, is recon. This is something you'll hear if you ever take any pen testing class. You'll hear recon is first and foremost, because we got to identify the cloud resources and asset that an organization uses and the different cloud assets that they utilize, and also any other host that we might want to attack. Like if we're looking at an organization that has VPN services and has various web services, those might be things that we're going to want to attack down the line anyway. So recon is necessary. This is pretty much the same methodology that I utilize throughout most of the pen tests that I do. Like I mentioned, a lot of these organizations have limited deployments so far in cloud providers, but some have straight up fully embraced it and have everything out there. So they have like their full AD infrastructure, production assets, security products that manage, all their entire infrastructure. And the key thing for us in recon, is mainly finding, is there AD connectivity? Because I like attacking Active Directory. That is something that I find to be most useful when attacking an environment. Yes, there are some organizations that have a lot of their resources built into just straight up web apps and have services like that utilize a backend database for authentication, which that's absolutely amazing to look at too. That's more of a web app testing thing though. When we look at actually accessing an enterprise organization's assets, we're really looking at AD connectivity. So on-prem, we're looking for anything that looks like NTLM authentication, which, SharePoint servers, AWS, anything like that typically ends up being some sort of AD-backed thing. Same thing with like VPN services. A lot of times those are straight up AD-backed authentication. And, looking at those, looking at mail gateways, any sort of web apps we can find, file storage, we're going to try to basically just enumerate everything we can about an organization. Because, like while I mentioned Active Directory is something that I'd like to attack, we also want to look at attacking web services, because I mentioned earlier that web services can have more interesting access as well. So our traditional host discovery still applies. A good initial way to understand an organization's cloud usage is basically to resolve any names you find. I mean, it sounds super simple, but a lot of times, like after we've done our recon and after we've kind of enumerated all the domains, we can look at just enumerating the IP space. And like 90% of the time, you'll find that the IPs are just hosted in Microsoft, AWS, or GCP. And so in a few slides, I have the list of where those IP ranges are, as well as another script, because Google kind of makes it hard to find GCP ranges. The other big thing is MX records to kind of show cloud-hosted mail providers. So they will straight up tell you if they're leveraging O365 just from the MX records. Same thing with like Proofpoint. For recon, I really like to use Recon NG. It's probably my go-to. Mainly, I've just been using it a long time. I'm sure there are plenty of other tools out there too that do just as well, but I personally still leverage Recon NG pretty heavily. It basically helps function as a collection of all the things that you're gathering. And I think that's really important, because there's a lot of websites that do really good subdomain discovery, but they don't really throw them into like a database for you and store them and help you collect all this information you're gathering during recon as well. The thing with a lot of these recon tools, a lot of them leverage API keys to different services. So you'll have a recon tool that talks to Shodan, the internet-wide port scanning tool, and you need an API key for that. like I said, I think the unified collection is really a must. But I mean, any of this kind of helps. But as long as you can kind of help collect that data and sort through it, then you're probably good to go. So the other thing, so GoBuster I put on here. GoBuster is great for brute forcing subdomains, but also really, really good and fast at brute forcing web files and directories. So this is really good if you want to discover hidden content on a web application, which might be something definitely to look at if you're looking at like an AWS web server. All right, super simple and straightforward. Let's do some Google searching up front. It seems simple, but honestly, it's a really good starting point. It's a really good starting point. It's if you're about to attack an organization, might as well just Google their domain name and see if you can find some interesting targets just off that, right? The other thing is a lot of the search engines have Google dorks, right, or what they call dorks, which is basically the way that you can leverage search engines to search for specific things. So you can do site:targetdomain.com, and then that next bit of search will only search in that website that you're searching. You can do -site:, and it'll take it out of the rest of the searches. So you could do site:targetdomain.com -site: www.targetdomain.com, and it will just give you the results of everything that comes back without the www. And you can keep adding more and more on there so that you can get deeper and find more domains. The other thing to keep in mind too is that other search engines like Baidu, DuckDuckGo can sometimes give you more data than Google and Bing, because for one, a lot of sites have the robots.txt file that has limitations for certain scanners, and so not every site's going to get scanned because of those limitations. The other thing is that other search engines categorize and catalog different data. Things like email addresses. If you go try to search an email address on Google, it doesn't really work. But you go search on Baidu, the Chinese search engine, you can find some email addresses. Okay, search transparency. I think let's do this slide and maybe the next one, and then we can take a break. Okay, so certificate transparency this is probably my favorite Recon tool. This is something that I think is maybe a little less utilized to its full potential, if that makes sense. So search transparency, essentially what it is it's a framework that logs SSL, TLS certificates for websites. And there's this site, crt.sh, that allows you to search the search transparency logs, okay? This is useful for us because you might discover that, first off, you can discover subdomains. I just saw a reference to ctfr.py. Yeah, that's a great tool that also searches as well. So hit up ctfr.py for searching search transparency. One thing that I will mention here, that one reason that that we might want to utilize a different service is because of top level domains. So with cert.sh and with census.io specifically is another site that searches and categorizes these. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that certificates can have multiple domains registered to the single certificate. So if an organization is leveraging or has a number of web services out there that have a certificate that, let's say that the domain name is targetdomain.com, and that certificate is their like public, like this is what we use for our websites, like this is our environment for being not non-employee driven, if that makes sense. So a lot of times what we'll see is we have companies that divide their public presence based off of domain name. And what I mean by that is they have like their .com, which is their public facing like websites, blogs, that kind of thing. And then you have like maybe like a .net or .org or some other completely different .com that is like VPN resources, mail resources, SharePoint, all these other things, right? That are employee stuff that the public doesn't need to know about. So it's not advertised. It's not something you can Google search and find. But if they use the same cert that actually signs a single domain over here that signs a different domain, a lot of times you can just look at those cert transparency records and find where the other domain is. And so that's super useful if you want to find other top level domains. Like I've had multiple companies that I'm like looking at these public servers. I'm like this is just all like brochure stuff, like blogs and things like that. But the second you find that other top level domain, it's like, oh wow, here's all the place I actually want to go attack, So totally recommend looking at that. And the same thing with the TLDs is to rinse and repeat, right? So as soon as you find another top level domain, rinse and repeat everything, go back through it, and go back through all your recon. It looks like we're at the 1 p.m. mark, so let's go ahead and take a break here, and then we'll jump on some more recon.
Beau, do you want to step away, or do you want to answer questions?
I can answer questions. I'm good.
So what this is for 10 minutes. Everyone, you can come back at 1:10 p.m. or whatever 10 minutes is for you in your time zone. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Beau's going to answer some rapid fire questions at this time. So if you have questions, if you're like, wait, what about this? What about this? What about this? Based on what we've already talked about, so please don't ask questions about things you're like, are you going to ask this? Or are you going to ask this? Or are you going to talk about this? Or are you going to talk about this? So based on what we've already talked about, the break is 10 minutes. And someone said shots time. I don't know if that's
shots time.
Yeah. And one of the reasons, people have asked us, like, hey, is the chat available? Like, this chat's always available. So if you want to go back through and look at the questions that have already been asked and answered, you can always do that. But let's see, what do we got here? What is the best way to connect to O65 with a service account from an on-prem server for pulling down data? Certificate, JSON key pair?
So specifically for just grabbing the data, or I guess like the other thing that could be that question could be taken as is, or do you mean like syncing the data? Because with Azure, right, you have the directory sync service that syncs the data. But I think what the question means is, like, what's the best way to just go about authenticating? So you don't have to use a service principal for that. If you want to just grab the data, you can just use a straight up user account, because the Microsoft Graph API is available, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit with the password sparing section, because one of the things we hit is the Graph API. Next question.
You mentioned going over scope. Seems like you can get crazy real quick with what you find. How do you handle that with client during call?
Yeah, so typically I like to straight up ask at the forefront, right? Like, do you guys use this? And most of the time the answer is yes, but we don't know how much we use. Or yes, we don't have specific things to give you to determine like how much we use it. But it usually what happens is this. What happens is typically is we'll get to the recon phase, and we'll start going through analyzing, subdomains, net blocks, that kind of stuff. And then oftentimes we'll find completely different stuff that's completely out of scope that is owned by the same customer. And what I typically do is just go to the customer and say, hey, here's a bunch of things that I found. Is this stuff that you didn't know about and you want to test it? Or, because we'll find legacy stuff all the time. Like, not even just cloud related, but just legacy in general, that basically, like, whenever you go looking at recon, the company didn't even know that stuff was still out there. So I'll go talk to them about it and say, hey, is this stuff that you would consider in scope?
Is it considered best practice to have separate certificates based on what resources you are using them on? Public facing, internal org, so on, like you had mentioned.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the main reason is, so like the question about public facing, right? The second somebody compromises a web server that's public, if that certificate is there and it's reused for private resources, then that'd be a bad day. So yeah, definitely separate resources.
All right, what is the name of the baseball field behind you?
That is Yankee Stadium. So sorry, any Red Sox fans that are on, I apologize.
How hard is it to penetrate a cloud perimeter if the company has the IAM locked down for all the resources?
How hard is what? So locked down is probably a perspective question or perspective thing. So IAM is a huge subject, and actually, IAM in general is something that I spend like a good chunk of the next day of class talking about just IAM and roles because it's complex. So locking down, meaning like you don't give access to certain resources based off of IAM roles. Yeah, it makes it harder. It absolutely makes it harder, but is it done right is the thing that we typically look for. Dude, you're on Hero Course now, so ashamed. I'm Ticket, that's a Red Sox fan.
This is an interesting question. How often does Microsoft/AWS/Google contact BHIS about your exploitation methods? I.e., do they ever want to learn more about how you're getting in?
Only if we've gone through the vulnerability disclosure process and they decide it's not a vulnerability, and then we go public with it. And then, do a talk, and then it starts getting exploited by like real bad guys. That happens. And then they talk to us.
Yeah, I remember something about a calendar.
Yeah, calendar injection. That was one of them. But actually, we'll talk about calendar injections in a little bit because that's one of the slides in this whole thing. But basically, we haven't had the best, results in getting certain things fixed. And a lot of times it really comes down to they don't think it's a vulnerability because it's like a feature, right? Like everyone knows it's just a feature. Like it's supposed to work that way. But yeah, that's the gist of that.
What is your personal best tool to access open S3 buckets, and what can be done if we find open S3 buckets?
Great question. We got a lab on that and just a few slides.
Fantastic. What do you do about contracts when the new scope is discussed? Is it typically included, or do you revise?
So at Black Hills, the way we typically scope things is total number of assets, and this also depends on the type of engagement. So for example, if we're doing an external network assessment, right? Like so one where we're remote and the company wants us to test their external network assets. A lot of times they just give us a number of total IPs, so like 50, 100, 3,000, that kind of thing. And then typically give us some ranges or specific IP addresses as a scope. And if we find that, that number's under, then, we just add in what we can. And it's usually not like we have to go revise something unless it's just an insane amount. Like if we find that there's like another 500 hosts or something crazy, then yeah, we go and revise. But a lot of times it's just, hey, here's some extra few things that I found. You want us to test them.
All right. What about searching for AWS Azure keys and credentials on GitHub?
Yep, that's a lab coming up. We're going to be looking for them.
And then let's see. Would you please mention the differences between how red team works versus working threat actors? I've heard that they do different things, but not sure how or why.
Biggest difference is time and resources. Okay. And what I mean by that is with a red team assessment from an organization that you're paying, right? So if you're paying a company like Black Hills to do an assessment, a red team assessment, you get a couple people, right? You get like 2 or 3 of us, maybe, depending on how much time you have allotted to the test. And generally, the red team assessments are not super long engagements, right? Like generally, we do like maybe like 2 or 3 testers for like 3 to 4 weeks of total testing, right? And the difference there is that real threat actors have forever to do what they want, right? I mean, they have all the time in the world. So the biggest difference is they can go about their hacking and whatnot at the speed they want. So that provides them a lot more availability to be less noisy. And it gives them a lot more time to think through every decision they make.
Last question for now. For AWS and Azure, are there any built-in utilities to check SSL certificates like expiration dates, etc.? Just wondering any other tools that we would recommend.
I'm not sure. I would imagine that the certificate management within Azure and AWS probably have some sort of alerting for certificate expiry, but I don't know for sure.
All right, we're just going to take a nice deep cleansing breath. Just getting ready for the... And we're back.
All right, we're back.